We're going to study this week on a lesson I've prepared and given many times in the past on the crucifixion, the physical part of crucifixion and Jesus' death. We're celebrating Easter. We're celebrating the resurrection of Jesus. That point in history that gives us all hope. Without that, we'd have no hope. But my part in this, I think, is to give a description, the best I can do it, of what Jesus suffered for us in his death. Years ago, Brother Steve Bliffen was a minister at the Christian church in West Liberty, asked me to give a help and participate in one of his Bible classes to describe the physical aspects of crucifixion from a physician standpoint, and I accepted to do that, and we did have that class, and since then that got my interest going, and since then I've done a lot of study in that direction and try to pick up wherever I can and whatever I could, the experiments and the different sources on crucifixion and those kind of things, in particular what how that pertains to our Lord Jesus. Steve had gotten an article, or found an article, in the Journal of American Medical Association, which was published in March of 1986. It was written by the pathology department at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And they did a great job in looking at the actual proofs and what would happen to a person in certain circumstances, and certainly that's a great article. I've read it a lot, and but I went past that. I went on trying to find out more about the history and more on the physical part of crucifixion. I'm going to have to rely a whole lot on my notes. I've been going all day, but I definitely want to get back to my notes the best I can. There's a couple of scriptures that I was going to bring in to the lesson plan, and but I kept trying to find out where's the best. So I decided, well, we'll just start there. So first scripture is in John 3:16, and God said that He gave His only begotten Son. He gave Him to us. And in John 10:17 through 18, Jesus said that He laid down His life. It was His. Let me go back and read that. Let's see. John 10:17, 18. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life, only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, for I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. So Jesus gave his life. Though we're going to be studying how brutal a death he suffered at the hands of his fellow man, it wasn't, though they planned it and they carried it out, it was Jesus' decision to lay his life down. And it was God's decision to give his son for our salvation. As best can be determined, and just like I said on my last message, that I've never found two doctors agree on anything, and it's the same with historians. They find some way to disagree, but as best can be determined by the sources, and there's been a tremendous amount of research done in this, that Jesus died in Jerusalem in AD 30 by crucifixion. He died during that time called the Passover, which is an event, annual event that the Jews celebrated to commemorate their release from slavery in Egypt many hundreds of years before. But again, they were under bondage. In 63 BC, Pompey, the Roman general Pompey, had conquered Judea, and now the Jewish people were again under the command of another power. During the Passover, this was a pilgrimage feast. It was a time that the Jews would gather from all over the world and come for this event to celebrate this occasion. And Jerusalem was usually a city in the neighborhood of 50,000 or so, but during the Passover feast, that population would jump to 300,000, and I saw estimates up to 1 million people. So that kind of gets us the picture of a lot of things, because there's so many people now in Jerusalem. And that's why that Herod Antipas, who is the Roman governor of Judea, which normally is stationed in Caesarea, which is on the Mediterranean coast, is now in Jerusalem. And that's why that Herod Antipas, did I say Pontius Pilate, Herod Antipas? I said it was Pontius Pilate was a Roman governor. Herod Antipas was the tetrarch, and he lived in Tiberias. Both people in command living far away, and were instrumental in Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus arrived in Bethany, a small village 2 miles southeast of Jerusalem, 1 week prior to the Passover. He went there to spend time with his friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, and to spend the Sabbath with them. After spending the Sabbath with his friends, he made his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and people loved him, and they were actually, I think the meal was that maybe this would be our new king or a new ruler. And this is they threw their cloaks down before him. He rode on a donkey just as prophesied, and they threw their cloaks down for him, and palms and so on, celebrating his arrival. He spent that week, which is Passion Week, teaching and preaching in Jerusalem, and then in the evening going to the Mount of Olives to pray. In AD 30, the Passover began on Thursday, April the 6th. Jesus had made arrangements to take the Passover meal, which was the beginning of the Passover, in a private dwelling in Jerusalem, in an upper room. And he gathered there and had the meal with his friends, and this meal will be remembered forever as the Lord's Supper or the Last Supper. After the meal, he went to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. He loved the Garden of Gethsemane. That was one of his favorite places. And he took 3 of his friends with him, Peter, James, and John. And he is actually there in the Garden of Gethsemane, where I like to, where actually it happened that his suffering began. In Matthew 26:36 to 39. Go over that. He began to be sorrowful and troubled. Then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow, to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." We know that he went a stone's throw to pray, and we know that he came back 3 times and his friends were sleeping. Of course, he was very disappointed. But on Luke 22 and 44, we get a grasp of how Jesus was suffering. Let's see. 22. It says here, and it's interesting to me that it was Luke the physician that recorded this. In 2042. Luke was saying that Jesus was so intense in his prayers. Yeah, here it is in 44, that his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground. So it doesn't say that he sweat blood, but there is a condition called hemohidrosis or hematidrosis, in which people in great anguish can hemorrhage into their sweat glands. Now what this does, it doesn't lead to a lot of blood loss, but it makes the skin very sensitive, very painful. So it would be a possibility, because one of the things that I really emphasize is that Jesus suffered it all. He suffered it all for us. After midnight on Thursday, Jesus was arrested. It was a large group of men armed with swords and clubs, led by Judas, one of his disciples. Judas had earlier gone to the Sanhedrin, which is the Jewish high court, and for a price would betray his friend. And the price was 30 pieces of silver. And Judas was willing to sell him out for that. This was a real opportunity for the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a Jewish high court composed of chief priests, elders, teachers of the law, higher-ups. There were 71 of them, and they made the final decisions. They had been planning for weeks to kill Jesus. They were looking for an opportunity. They didn't want to do it at the time of Passover because they were afraid that they would riot and they'd have a big disturbance. But this gave them an opportunity to do just that. So Judas betrayed him, and Jesus was arrested. And one thing that I know I'm studying at this time that I hadn't really paid so much attention to before, but he was bound. His hands were tied right there, and apparently they stayed tied the whole rest of the evening, and all these trials that he'd be going through. There was a struggle. Peter cut off Malchus's ear. Nobody really believes that he was aiming for his ear. But Jesus replaced that ear, told him there'd be no fight, no struggle. And after that, his friends abandoned him. And Jesus had predicted that he would be abandoned. And here he is alone. I once gave this talk, and there was a priest in the audience, and after the meeting, he came up, and this is the one thing that disturbed him most, that Jesus was left alone through his suffering. He was that really, of all the things, that bothered him most. In Luke 22:52 through 53, then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs? Every day I was with you in the temple courts, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, when darkness reigns." That's a very catchy statement to me, because Satan had been turned loose. He could do it all now. Jesus was brought back to Jerusalem, and make no mistake, this was a political assassination. It was a political murder. I hate to admit it, but at one time in my life I felt that it was the Jewish piety or Jewish sense of righteousness or something like that that had led to Jesus being arrested and so forth. But no, it was power. Jesus was led to the cross because of greed and envy. The first stop in Jerusalem in the wee hours of the morning was to Annas. Annas had been the chief priest from AD 5 to AD 15 to 16. He was deposed by the Romans, but he was able to manipulate and get his sons first appointed to the chief priest, and then his son-in-law. So his son-in-law was Caiaphas, and he was the chief priest at the time of Jesus' execution. While at Annas, he was slapped, accused of different things, trying to find some kind of a guilt that they could execute him. But from there, from Annas, he went to Caiaphas, who was the high priest at that time, and he was questioned intensely. They accused him of all kinds of things. They couldn't find anything he was guilty of. They spit in his face, and slapped him, and blindfolded him, and struck him with fists, and just beat on him. And they couldn't find anything except Caiaphas, the high priest, came up with the accusation of blasphemy, that's speaking out against God. And blasphemy to the Jews was punishable by death. However, the Jews weren't allowed to execute anyone. They were under control of the Romans, and the Romans were the only ones that could execute. Just take a good bit. So the next step is at daybreak. The Roman governor started his day at daylight. So after Annas had questioned Jesus and Caiaphas' residence and the Sanhedrin, he was taken to the Sanhedrin, and the councils finally made the accusation of blasphemy, and he must die. They couldn't execute him, so they took him to the Roman governor, who was Pilate. And Pilate knew this was an innocent man. He didn't want anything to do with this. So he sent him to Herod Antipas. And that Herod Antipas was the son of Herod the Great. And Herod was the man who beheaded John the Baptist. And Herod at one time had wanted to actually kill Jesus, but he couldn't get it done. But he brought Jesus this time. He just wanted him to see him doing miracles, wanted to put on a show. Well, of course, Jesus didn't oblige him, and he sent him back to Herod, or back to Pilate, and Pilate finally gave in to the crowd and sent Jesus to be crucified. The by Roman law, the person being crucified had to be scourged first. Scourging was a brutal beating. The individual was stripped of his clothes, tied on a post, and remember, it's cold. If you remember, Peter had to warm by the fire, and it was cold, but he stripped of his clothes, and usually there were two lictors, and the instrument was a flagrum. It was a whip with a wooden handle and thongs of leather with metal balls and pieces of bone in the leather thongs. The purpose of this thing was to shred flesh and to bruise deeply. It was a brutal thing, and most of the time the people that finished up this would die anyway. Their death was already sure. But the Jews would not allow over 40 licks. So they always stopped at 39. But the Romans didn't have any limits. They just kept beating. And we know that Jesus' beating was very bad, very bad. Let's see what the next one is. After the scourging, the individual was to be crucified. And the history of crucifixion goes many hundreds and hundreds of years. It first started out with the Persians, then the Greeks took it up, but the ones that made the most of it were the Romans. I think it's Caesar Augustus bragged how he crucified 30,000 at one time. But the Greeks would go in and they'd crucify a whole town just for the terror tactic. So went to the next town, they'd give in. But there were different kinds of cross. Sometimes it was just an upright post, or maybe just two beams side by side. The one that was used most in this day, and I believe that's the Latin cross, tall cross. Anyway, the Latin cross, I believe, was one used by the Romans in Jesus' day. Let's go on down to the next one. The cross was had two parts really. It had the patibulum and the stipes. The stipes was a lot of times a permanent post. It was there permanently. But the patibulum was a crossbeam, maybe about 6 feet across. And usually that's what the victim carried to his execution. It was the patibulum. And it weighed about 40 pounds, they figured. But we know that Jesus, after that terrible beating that he received, was not able to carry his cross, and they made Simon of Cyrene come and carry it for him. At the side of the crucifixion, let's see what that next one is, yeah. At the side of the crucifixion, the individual was thrown to the ground and attached to the cross. And the Romans preferred nailing him to the cross. And there's been some discrepancy over the years, and as you watch this, they kind of go back and forth about Jesus being nailed through the hands. And there's been experiments, believe it or not, where they would take cadavers and nail them through the hands, and they wouldn't support the weight of the body. But in the ancients, the hand and wrist were the same. It was the hand. So they were probably, and the best I can understand, this is the way they were done. They were nailed through the wrist, where a couple of things would happen. They were nailed, there wouldn't be a lot of blood loss, but they would also sever the median nerve, and that would give lancinating pain through both arms continuously. And that was the whole purpose of crucifixion, was to make it as painful as possible, as brutal as possible. The spike was usually about 7 inches or so, and they've actually found one. They uncovered a person that had been crucified, and the spike got caught, and he was nailed through the heel. and they couldn't pull that nail out. So they've got that as one of the artifacts now. So we'll go ahead and move on. And they were nailed also through the feet. I think just to help them live a little longer. They want them to suffer as long as they could and as painful as they could. And we'll just go on to the next one. So, Jesus was placed on the cross at 9 o'clock in the morning, Friday morning. While Jesus was on the cross, he spoke 7 times. And I'd like to read a couple of those. In Mark, let's see. Mark 15:34. At the 6th hour, darkness came over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? To this, God had turned his back on his son. And this was the ultimate of suffering. Because Jesus was faithful, because he obeyed, that's why he was on the cross, and God had turned his back. That's one thing I wanted to do in these talks, is always show that Jesus suffered it all. Another statement he made from the cross in Luke 22, it's Luke 23 and 46. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he said this, he breathed his last. So one thing that struck me there was that he was coherent to his last breath. He didn't lapse into a coma. He knew it was time to go. He said it was always in his command, and so it was time to go. But he didn't lapse into a coma. This is what the point I was trying to make there. A lot of discussion has been on what led to the actual physical death of Jesus on that day. Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours. And believe it or not, there were people that would be on the cross for 2 or 3 days. And suffering beyond imagination. One thing I was impressed with was birds of prey would feed on these people. And their eyes, ears, and so on and so forth. But Jesus was on the cross for 6 hours. And the mechanisms involved, of course, what a tremendous amount of suffering it had. He started out today a young, healthy man in his early 30s, no blemish. That was one of the big parts of the plan. He had no blemish. But through this terrible night and all the ordeals he'd been through, plus the scourging, then to be placed on a cross, the physiological part of that cross, and I think that most people really agree that there isn't. What took his life was exhaustive. They call it exhaustive asphyxia, which means when you're hanging from that cross, your inhalation, you're fixed in inhalation. In order to exhale, you had to pull up against those spikes in your hands and your feet, and eventually smother. It was Passover, and this was the day before the Sabbath. And these men, remember, there were two men crucified with Jesus. These men had to be off the cross before 6 o'clock, because that's when the next day began, when the Sabbath began. So the way they would do that is to shorten that person's life is a procedure they call crucifracture. They would fracture the legs where he couldn't push up to breathe, so they immediately suffocate. But they come to Jesus and he was already dead. Yeah, I need the last one now. So in order to make sure that he was dead, they thrust a spear into his chest. And this is where I believe, or at least a good explanation, where both blood and water came forth. So the spear trajectory would be going through two spaces. It'd be going through the pleural space and the pericardial space. With as much stress and anguish and suffering and everything Jesus had done, no doubt that there was effusion, or you would suspect effusion, which is a clear serous fluid, usually, in the lungs and in the pericardium. And so that's where, when they made sure he was dead, they both blood and water came through. It's like I said in the last visit, that if you need us for anything and you want help, if you decided to give your life over to Christ, you're the eldership here, any of us, will be glad to come to you.
In the garden sore oppressed, Jesus uttered this request: Father, if it so may be, let this cup depart from me. In the garden howling moan, weeping there so bitterly, yet the awful cup would drink for you and me. Judas now with traitor kiss gives him to his enemies. See that wild and noisy crowd, they will kill the Son of God. In the garden howling moan, weeping there so bitterly, yet the awful cup would drink for you and me. Now the Jewish council tried and resolved that he shall die. He of witness false and prayed is to Pilate led away. In the garden howling moan, weeping there so bitterly, yet the awful cup would drink for you and me. Robe and crown in mockery, and the taunting soldiers see him now on Calvary's road, sinking neath his heavy load. In the garden howling moan, weeping there so bitterly, yet the awful cup would drink for you and me. View him now upon the cross, us to save from endless loss, dying there upon the tree, dying